Hello, I'm Doug Muzzio. This is City Talk. One step forward and two back. Ineffective, unwise, perverse, insidious. Those words and phrases are some of the Fiscal Policy Institute's description of Governor Cuomo's 2015-16 budget proposal. To talk New York State and New York City budget, taxes, and spending is James Parrott, Chief Economist and Deputy Director at the Fiscal Policy Institute. The Institute deals with economic, fiscal, and budgetary policy issues and works to increase understanding of New York State's and New York City's tax system and the adequacy of state and local public services. It is generally characterized as liberal or progressive. Welcome back, James.
Thank you, Doug.
Okay, let's start with the most recent March 2nd, Monday, policy brief, education tax credit. This is insidious, you say.
This is very unwise use of state resources.
Explain what it is.
And it's bad tax policy. It would provide for contributions, for charitable contributions to either public schools or to so-called educational scholarship organizations, which could include scholarship organizations connected to elite prep schools,
right,
for that matter. A 75% tax credit, which is off the charts relative to the deduction you get for mortgage interest or other charitable contributions, which is, equal to your top tax bracket. So it's 5 to 8% in New York. This is a 75% credit. Moreover, it's structured in a way that it's allocated basically on a first-come, first-served basis with an individual cap of $1 million. So in New York, what does that mean? That means wealthy people who can make really large charitable contributions to these educational scholarship organizations will line up, soon after the first of the year and claim their credit. After all, that's a 75% credit. So this basically, what it amounts to is the state delegating its spending authority to private individuals. And, for a governor who makes a lot out of accountability in how we spend taxpayer resources, what accountability is there for use of these resources? Zero.
Okay, what's the politics?
Well, the politics is that the governor likes to reduce taxes, so this is yet another tax credit. I was part of the governor's Tax Reform and Fairness Commission, where we noted that the state has just, gone off the charts in terms of the mushrooming of various business tax credits and other tax credits. So this is another tax credit. This is a way for very wealthy donors, and donors there has two meanings, right? It's the person who makes a charitable donation, but in effect, it could also be somebody who is making a campaign donation who likes the way that this is structured because it's going to appeal to and serve and be for the benefit of very wealthy donors.
So this is a piece of political strategy to enhance the governor's political position.
Yes, and the irony is that it has a lot of support from parochial schools, from the Catholic Church,
right,
from middle-income parents and so on. In the Senate version of this, there's a provision for teachers to get reimbursement when they pay out of pocket for school supplies and so on. All of that is beside the point. That's not the way this will actually work, but there are a lot of people up in Albany today, all the month of March, lobbying for this, and yet, people should be wary of how it's going to work out in practice.
But that's how, it
is insidious.
All right. But it's all in the framing and the narrative, and that narrative has been dominant. This may be what you're producing, and the report and the reaction may be part of the counter-narrative.
Right.
Okay. Before we get into the sort of the nuts and bolts of the budget, let's look at the two sides of the checkbook. Let's look at the money that's coming in and the money that's going out, the revenues and expenditures. So in your shared opportunity agenda 2015 to 2016, you look at the revenues and the expenditures. And we can see when you look at the revenues that it's the personal income tax 51%, the sales tax 17%, business taxes at 8%, and then a whole conjury of other taxes. Lottery revenues, etc. Now, what is wrong with this distribution, if you will, from a policy point of view?
So there are two things to keep in mind. One is that this is just on the state side.
Okay.
When you look at total state and local expenditures in New York State contributes the third least among the 50 states.
Wow.
So our state taxes are about average, but our local taxes are very high because the state has shifted responsibilities for funding things like schools and Medicaid, and it doesn't provide very much in terms of local aid. Policy analysts look at it and say that you should fund government at the broadest possible level. So you should do it on a statewide basis with a tax like the income tax.
Right.
And the income tax is the largest tax at the state level, but at the local level, it's very regressive.
Yep.
Property taxes and sales taxes. When you put all of that together and look at the state and local tax burden, we have in New York a regressive tax system where middle income and low income families are paying a greater share of their income in state and local taxes than high-income families are.
Okay, now, sort of to move into tax policy, how do you make those taxes, should you choose to, less regressive, more progressive?
Well, so to the governor's credit, he has a proposal for a circuit breaker on the property tax.
So there's some good news in there.
There's some good news in the budget. There's certainly, the state has a windfall of $5 billion plus in bank settlement monies that the governor's proposing to use a lot of that for infrastructure spending. So that's
wise.
That's a positive thing. But this circuit breaker proposal finally is a serious attempt to help those people who are truly burdened by high property taxes. It's structured in a way, it's linked to the state's income tax. So it provides relief in proportion to the extent to which property taxes are a high share of a household's income.
Okay.
And it's capped at incomes of $250,000. So it's progressive in its impact. The only problem with that is, there is a caveat to this, is that it's not really paid for. It will have to, it will entail, if the state goes through with this, significant budget cuts in future years to provide the wherewithal for the state to do this.
Okay, and that'll get us into the unforced austerity that you talk about here. But let's go back to the graphics for a moment and look at the other side of the ledger, and that is expenditures. And if we look at it, it's pre-K and health. You know, a majority, 51% of the expenditures are coming out there, with pre-K to 12 education the greatest, and then followed by higher education, mental hygiene, etc. Talk about the education funding in this budget and its impacts, other than the tax credit.
Right. It's really inadequate. Relative to what the total spending on K through 12 education is, the state share of state and local education spending is, it's much lower than what it was 30, 40 years ago. The state is not really honoring the legislation that was put in place in 2007 when Governor Spitzer took office to respond to the court decision in the Campaign for Fiscal Equity. So the state is still about $5 to $6 billion short of where it should be, just to provide a sound basic education, adjusting for rising costs since 2007.
So the executive and the legislative branches are simply ignoring a judicial decision.
Well, so what usually happens in budgets in recent years is that the legislature will increase the education aid that the governor's proposed in the budget. That happened last year.
That's part of the choreography here.
We'll see what happens this year. This year, the governor's done something else, which he's done in a few instances throughout the budget. He's linking things. So he says, I'm going to increase education aid by $1.1 billion, provided that local governments embrace his education reforms, having to do with changes in the way teachers are evaluated, changes in tenure, increasing a cap on charter schools, and so on. So it's basically my way or the highway, and it remains to be seen. The legislature, you would think, and it doesn't like those conditions put on how it's going to appropriate money.
It's let's make a deal with a hammer over your head. Right. I mean, clearly it is competitive in really sort of a perverse way. For example, the economic development stuff as well as the education stuff. It's deal making. It's bludgeoning. It's, I'll make you a deal you can't refuse type stuff.
And a really unfortunate example of that is part of the $5 billion in the bank settlement money. Governor wants to set aside. Granted, the upstate economy has been weak. Employment growth has only been 0.4% in the recovery period. Yep. 1/4 of what it's been nationally, and much less than the 2.5% growth that we've seen in New York City. So the upstate economy needs help. So the governor says, here's $1.5 billion out of the $5 billion settlement that we're going to use, but we're going to make upstate regions compete against one another. There's 7 upstate regions. Yep. 3 of them will be the lucky winners of $500 million apiece. The other 4 will get zip out of that. And, the entire upstate economy needs help. And you really want to have a situation where you force regions into this cutthroat competition against each other? Don't all upstate New Yorkers deserve assistance from Albany?
I agree, being a resident in one of those areas that is likely not to get that money. You talk, and the Institute talks about this budget being unforced austerity, as well as a let's make a deal budget proposal. What do you mean unforced austerity?
So the governor's basic premise in doing budgeting is to limit spending growth to 2% a year, which is about what projected inflation is.
Right.
Even though needs may be rising, here we are.
Certainly, labor costs will rise.
5 years after the recession has ended, and yet needs, if anything, are greater than what they were before the recession. Two examples of that: the number of people receiving food stamps, which is a means-tested, federally funded program, has increased by 2/3 in the last 5 years upstate. Wow. The number of people who have turned to public assistance, with welfare reform and the increased stigma attached to receiving public assistance, and yet 50% more people are turning to public assistance just because their incomes have suffered so much in the wake of the recession. So the governor said, even though state, total income in the state and tax revenues are growing 4 to 6% a year, we're going to keep spending growth at 2% a year.
So in real dollars, you're falling behind all the time.
So that's unforced austerity. You're imposing that on yourself by choice.
Okay, now an element of the unforced then would be some kind of characterization of the state fisc, certainly, if not its economy. What's the status of the fisc? It's good. I mean, you mentioned the 5.4 that we have remaining from the bank settlement. Plus, you've got overall tax receipts increasing.
A lot of that's driven by the downstate economy, which is doing sort of a little bit better than the national average. The upstate economy is doing less than the national average. But tax revenues are coming in. There are a lot of high-income individuals in the downstate area, and so on. So tax revenues, were it not for tax cuts, and this governor has proposed a package of tax cuts each of the last 3 or 4 years.
Yep.
A big corporate tax reform package last year that could have been revenue neutral in making the way we tax corporations more efficient and effective without also providing a tax break at the same time.
Right.
So that's taking away revenue. So the governor is saying that we're going to limit spending to 2%, whatever the needs are, and basically that's led to a substantial downturn in state and local government employment, which has really held back recovery in the upstate
because they're not consuming.
Cities. So New York State has lost 75,000 state and local government workers. These are good middle-income paying jobs. In many regions upstate, they've lost 10% of state and local government workers.
But people could look at that and say, isn't that good that we're reducing the burden on taxes of these employees? I mean, I'm talking about the other side of the ideological fence.
Right, but you're not getting the services. So a lot of these cutbacks have been among school teachers, so class sizes have gone up. The course offerings and extra programs, the availability of those has been cut back. And at a local government level, there are fewer people repairing the roads, taking care of the parks, and so on. If we have an economic development challenge upstate, how attractive can it be for a business to want to come and locate there when they visit that local community? Services are very inadequate. They're obviously inadequate because they've been eroded over the years by this 2% unforced austerity.
But it seems to me that this is a conflict between a mid and long-range perspective and a short-range political perspective. I mean, tax cuts and caps are buzzwords that resonate in a general population and an electorate.
Well, but people are, people are concerned about shared prosperity. They want to see sustained economic growth, and they want to see an environment where most people can share in that. There's very little in the governor's approach that would move us in that direction.
And also, there doesn't seem to be a figure to personify the issue that in some sense articulates this counter-narrative that you're establishing and Fiscal Policy Institute and others are establishing. There's no central focus for this, this counter-narrative.
Well, it's central focus in terms of legislative action.
Yeah,
well,
right.
So there's an effort to increase the minimum wage. The state, the governor was party to increase the minimum wage in 2013,
right,
up to $9 an hour,
right,
because of pressure brought to bear. The governor's proposing to increase
in part
it
from downstate and particularly from the mayor of the city of New York.
Well, from the mayor of New York City
and others.
And a lot of low-wage workers, fast food workers have been organizing, car wash workers, airport workers. A lot of organizing is taking place to put pressure on the governor to raise wage. So even before the final phase of the 2013 increase has taken place to raise it to $9 an hour, the governor's already proposing a two-tier increase,
right.
$11.50 at the end of 2016 in New York City, recognizing its higher living costs, $10.50 in the rest of the state. So that is part of the sort of the counter narrative. The governor is recognizing that, but a lot more needs to be done. Consider the data that we present in the report about the distribution of income gains in the first 3 years of this recovery, where you can see that all, not just most, all of the income, more than all of the income gains actually have gone to the top 1%. The incomes of the 99% are actually less after adjusting for inflation.
So we have this continuing chasm. It's a growing chasm. So
and to the governor's credit, he's starting to, this year for the first time, he's noting that inequality is a problem. He talked the other day when he announced the wage board decision to extend the last minimum wage increase in a modified form to tipped workers, waiters and waitresses and so on. He talked about, New York State has a real inequality challenge and we need to do things to raise wages and income. So we would say that tax reform and getting rid of the 2% spending cap are really key to providing an environment where we're investing more in high-quality education, K through 12, pre-K, higher education, and so on, investing in infrastructure.
And another thing being, sort of a local government official, but only in New Jersey, is state mandates, irrespective of spending, just what you're required to do without the state giving us funding to do this. But, in
Right.
the Board of Education in specific, I don't see the state walking back from its mandate mania.
Well, the state has said that it's going to take over any increase in local Medicaid costs. Any increase in Medicaid costs, the state is
but it's still paying 25%.
But still, New York State is one of the few states that requires localities to pay a significant share of Medicaid.
Half of the state's
So it
share.
could certainly go further. In the spending chart that you had before, if you look down at the bottom in the small print, you'll see aid to local governments. What share? 1%. And in inflation-adjusted terms, that figure is 75% less than what it was 40 years ago.
Wow. So you're really talking of a real diminishing of state effort on a horizon of activities.
The 2% spending cap has meant that the state is retreating from its commitment to honor the CFE decision, to fund public schools, and to do that in a way that helps high poverty areas provide for the sort of comprehensive education supports that you need. And it hasn't been providing the local aid that's needed.
Okay, let's go to that $5.4 billion windfall. Talk about what the governor is proposing to do, and if you were the governor, how you might distribute that money.
So I guess I would basically agree with the governor for about 2/3 of that. So he's saying, look, we're going to use some of that for the Thruway Authority and the Tappan Zee Bridge, and some for the MTA to allow it to finance Metro North stations in the Bronx, which would be an improvement and enhancement to New York City's transportation infrastructure.
But the MTA is still dramatically underfunded by the state.
Right. And the governor is basically, acting as if, what me worry, it's not my problem. And yet, everybody is saying, the mayor is saying that, look, governor, you have to provide leadership in helping the MTA to figure, if its capital budget, as the governor says, is too high, then help the MTA get to the point where it needs to be. But then fund, certainly it can't be that it's $15 billion too high, which is the amount that's unfunded at this point. So the governor is putting some of that, a lot of that money into infrastructure. But,
what about the other third?
As we talked before, there's this $1.5 billion for what's been referred to as the Hunger Games.
Of economic development.
Competition. So that money, we would say, take that $1.5 billion and spread it around in addressing real infrastructure needs. Water and sewer systems and transport, highways and bridges and things like that. The governor is setting aside, and I don't quarrel with this, $850 million in the event that the state loses an audit by the federal government for some federal funds that came into the state in recent years. So rather than that create,
big hunk of change.
Well, New York State gets about $40 to $50 billion a year from the federal government.
Except we send. I just have to. We send what, 70 or 80?
We do, because we have a lot of high-income people, and we have a moderately progressive income tax at this.
And we have some kind of obligation.
Senator Moynihan was a great senator and so on, and he was the one who first came up with the accounting that showed that we send a lot more to Washington. In part, that's because of the high wealth that we have in New York. So I guess I would change that to on the operating budget side, separate from the bank settlement money.
Go ahead.
The governor is using some of the tax collections for the state are coming in better than forecast by about $500 million. He's taking some of that and adding to the rainy day reserve fund for the state, which is a prudent use. So
there's some good news here.
Well, by the same token, we would have liked to have seen more of the $5 billion as bank settlement money used to help local governments and school districts replenish some of their own reserve funds, which have been drawn down because state aid has been cut so much.
Okay, we've got a minute, and I know that you folks are releasing, having a conference on March 10th on the New York City budget. Give us a brief preview. What's the situation, jobs, budget, economy, New York City?
So the city budget is in pretty good shape overall. The mayor has been making needed investments to make up for some of the decline in human services spending in recent years. So, I was just looking recently at the increase. So there's been like a 14% increase in human services spending in the last 2 years. He's doing a lot to help the housing authority, deal with its backlog of repairs and so on. The tax revenues have been coming in well for the city. The real estate market's doing well.
Sometimes it's better to be lucky
than good. The stock market has been doing well, and so on. So the out-year budget gaps are as low as they have been in memory. So the city is well positioned to continue addressing some of the challenges that it's facing.
Good, and we'll look forward to seeing your various reports on the city budget. You're going to come back at some point in May or June to talk about the city budget? Excellent. My thanks to James Parrott, Chief Economist and Deputy Director of the Fiscal Policy Institute, for his insight into the New York State and New York City budgets. Join me next week when my guest will be Eric Alterman to talk about his new book, Inequality in One City, Bill de Blasio and the New York Experiment, Year 1, here on CUNY TV. Hello, I'm Doug Muzzio. Let us know what you think about this show. You can reach us at CUNY.TV. When you get there, click on the bar that says Contact Us and send your email. Whatever it is. Thanks, no thanks, obnoxious, do it. Send it.